The note fluttered against the rough wooden door of the ranch house, pinned there by a single rusted nail. And when Jack O'Brien pulled it free that cold November morning in 1876, he had no idea the words scrawled across the yellowed paper would change everything about his solitary existence in Independence, Missouri. The handwriting was delicate, feminine, pressed hard into the paper as though written with urgency. Jack squinted at the words in the early dawn light, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. To whoever lives here, I need help. I have been traveling for 3 weeks from Pennsylvania. My wagon broke down 2 miles east near Willow Creek. I have little food left and winter is coming. If you have any kindness in your heart, please find me. I will repay you however I can. Florence Lancaster. Jack read the note 3 times, his calloused fingers careful not to tear the fragile paper. He lived alone on this ranch, had done so for the past 5 years since his parents passed from fever. At 32 years old, he had grown accustomed to the silence, to the endless days of mending fences and tending cattle with no voice but his own, and the occasional hand he hired during branding season. The note felt like a message from another world, one where people needed each other, where connection still mattered. He folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his coat pocket, then strode toward the barn where his mare, Copper, waited in her stall. The horse nickered softly as he approached, and Jack stroked her muzzle while reaching for the saddle. "Got someone to find, girl," he said quietly. 2 miles east. Let's hope we are not too late." The ride to Willow Creek took him through familiar territory, land he had known since childhood. The trees were mostly bare now, their branches skeletal against the gray sky. A light snow had fallen during the night, just enough to dust the ground and make tracking easier. He found the wagon exactly where the note said it would be, listing badly to one side with a broken wheel, abandoned except for a few scattered belongings that had clearly been sorted through with care. Jack dismounted and examined the scene. Footprints led away from the wagon, heading north toward the dense grove of cottonwoods that lined the creek. The prints were small, definitely a woman's boots, and they wandered slightly as though the person making them had been tired or disoriented. His jaw tightened. 3 weeks on the road from Pennsylvania meant she had been traveling since mid-October. Alone, most likely, given the size of the wagon and the single set of tracks. He followed the footprints into the trees, leading Copper by the reins. The snow made everything quieter, muffling even the sound of his own footsteps. After about a quarter mile, he spotted a lean-to constructed against the trunk of a massive cottonwood, built from branches and covered with a worn canvas tarp. A thin stream of smoke rose from a small fire that had burned down to embers. "Miss Lancaster," Jack called out, not wanting to startle whoever might be inside. "My name is Jack O'Brien. I found your note." There was movement from within the shelter, and then a woman emerged, crawling out on her hands and knees before standing slowly. Jack felt something shift in his chest at the sight of her. She was thin, too thin, with dark hair that fell in tangled waves past her shoulders. Her dress was travel-stained and torn at the hem, and she wore a man's coat that hung loose on her frame. But her eyes, deep brown and wary, held a fierce intelligence and determination that struck him immediately. "You found my note," she repeated, her voice hoarse. "I did not think anyone would. I left it 3 days ago when I went searching for help. There were no houses, no people, just your ranch. I thought it was abandoned." "It is not abandoned," Jack said carefully. "I was away checking my north pasture. Took me 2 days. Got back this morning and found what you left." He studied her face, noting the hollows beneath her cheekbones, the slight tremor in her hands. "When did you last eat?" Florence wrapped the oversized coat tighter around herself. "Yesterday morning. I had some hardtack left. It is gone now." Jack untied his saddlebag and pulled out the provisions he had brought, acting on instinct when he left the ranch. Dried beef, biscuits wrapped in cloth, a canteen of water. He held them out to her. "Eat slowly. If you have not had much, your stomach will not handle it well if you rush." She took the food with shaking hands, and he watched as she forced herself to eat the biscuit in small bites, tears forming in her eyes. Pride and relief warred on her face. "Thank you," she whispered between bites. "Thank you so much. What are you doing out here alone?" Jack asked, keeping his voice gentle. "Pennsylvania is a long way to travel without help." Florence finished the biscuit before answering, then took a careful sip of water. "I was not supposed to be alone. My brother and I left Philadelphia together. We were heading to Kansas, where he had been promised work on a cattle operation. We made it to Independence a month ago, but then he met a woman." She smiled, but it was sad. "Martha. She was wonderful, truly, and they fell in love so quickly. He wanted to stay, and I could not ask him to give up his happiness for me, so I continued on my own. To Kansas. Alone." Jack could not keep the disbelief from his voice. "Miss Lancaster, that is not safe. Even experienced travelers do not make that journey without company." "I am aware," she said, with a flash of spirit that made her eyes brighten. "But I did not have many options. We sold everything we had to make this trip. My brother gave me his share, thinking it would be enough to get me established. Then the wagon wheel broke, and I spent the last of my money on supplies in town before I left. I tried to fix it myself, but I do not have the right tools or the knowledge." Jack rubbed his jaw, thinking. The sensible thing would be to take her back to Independence, help her find respectable lodging until she could figure out her next step. But something in him resisted that idea, some selfish part that wanted to keep her close, at least for a little while. The ranch had been so empty for so long. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Yes, I grew up around horses." "Then come back to the ranch with me. You can recover your strength, and I will help you figure out what to do about Kansas." He saw her hesitation and added quickly, "There is a room you can use. It was my mother's sewing room. It has a good door with a lock. You will be safe." Florence looked at him for a long moment, assessing. Jack wondered what she saw, whether his face showed too much of the loneliness he carried, whether she could sense that he was already half gone on her just from this brief meeting. Finally, she nodded. "All right, but only until I can make a plan. I will not be a burden." "You are not a burden," Jack said firmly, "and we will get your things from the wagon before we go." They returned to the broken wagon together, and Jack helped Florence gather what remained of her belongings. There was not much. A carpet bag with some clothes, a wooden box containing what looked like sewing supplies, a Bible, and a framed photograph of a young man who resembled Florence enough to be her brother. She held each item as though it was precious, and Jack supposed it was. These things represented everything she had left. He tied her bag to his saddle, then helped Florence up onto Copper's back before swinging up behind her. She stiffened at first, clearly uncomfortable with the proximity, but as they began the ride back to the ranch, she gradually relaxed against him. Jack tried not to think about how good it felt to have her there, how right it seemed to have another person close after so many years of isolation. "Tell me about your ranch," Florence said after a while, breaking the comfortable silence. "It is not much," Jack admitted. 300 acres, about 100 head of cattle. I grow some hay, keep chickens and a few pigs. It was my father's place and his father's before that. I work it alone mostly, except during roundup when I hire help from town. That sounds like a lot for one person. It keeps me busy." He paused, then found himself saying more than he intended. "Maybe too busy. Sometimes I go days without speaking out loud. It gets quiet." Florence turned her head slightly, and he caught a glimpse of her profile. "I understand quiet," she said softly. "After our parents died 2 years ago, it was just my brother and me in that big house in Philadelphia. We rattled around in it like ghosts. That is partly why we decided to leave. Too many memories, too much silence." They rode on, and Jack found himself telling her about the ranch, about the challenges of the past year's drought, about his plans to expand the herd if he could save enough money. Florence listened, asking intelligent questions that showed she understood more about farming and ranching than he expected. By the time they reached the ranch house, the sun had climbed higher in the sky, burning off some of the morning chill. Jack helped Florence down from Copper's back and noticed how unsteady she was on her feet. "When did you last sleep in a real bed?" he asked. "Independence." "A month ago." He shook his head and guided her toward the house, one hand hovering near her elbow in case she stumbled. "Food first, then rest. Everything else can wait." The ranch house was simple but well built, 2 stories with a wide front porch and windows that let in good light. Jack had kept it clean despite living alone, a habit his mother had drilled into him. He led Florence inside and pointed her toward the kitchen while he stoked the fire in the stove. "Sit," he instructed, pulling out a chair at the worn wooden table. Florence obeyed without argument, which told him how exhausted she really was. He worked quickly, frying eggs and salt pork, slicing bread and setting out butter and jam his neighbor, Mrs. Henley, had given him last month. The domesticity of it felt strange and wonderful at the same time. Florence ate slowly as he had advised, but he could tell she wanted to devour everything on her plate. When she finally finished, she looked up at him with such gratitude that it made his chest ache. "I cannot remember the last time someone cooked for me," she said. "Thank you, Jack. You have been incredibly kind. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Florence said firmly. "They would not have. Most people would have left that note pinned to the door, figured it was not their problem. You came looking. That means something." Jack cleared the dishes to hide his reaction to her words. He was not used to being seen this way, to having someone acknowledge his actions as meaningful. "I will show you to your room," he said gruffly. "You need to rest." He led her upstairs to the small room that had belonged to his mother. It still smelled faintly of lavender, from the sachets his mother had made years ago, and that Jack had never removed from the dresser drawers. There was a narrow bed with a quilt his grandmother had stitched, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a window that looked out over the eastern pasture. "The sheets are clean," Jack said. "I will bring up water so you can wash if you want, and that lock I mentioned, it works." He demonstrated, showing her how the key turned smoothly in the mechanism. Florence set her carpetbag down on the bed and looked around the room with something like wonder. "It is perfect," she said quietly. "Thank you." Jack left her then, going back downstairs to give her privacy. He heard the soft click of the lock engaging and felt a strange mix of relief that she felt safe enough to secure the door and regret that she felt she needed to. He knew what people would say if they found out he had a woman staying at his ranch unchaperoned. Independence was a growing town, but it still held tight to certain proprieties. But looking at Florence's exhausted face, seeing the desperation in her eyes, he could not bring himself to care about gossip. He spent the afternoon on chores, mucking stalls and checking on the cattle in the near pasture. The work kept his hands busy, but his mind wandered constantly back to the woman sleeping upstairs. Who was Florence Lancaster really? What had driven her to make such a desperate journey? And why did he already feel protective of her, possessive even when he barely knew her? By the time evening fell, Jack had worked himself into a state of nervous energy. He prepared a simple supper of stew from yesterday's leftovers and set the table for 2. though he was not sure if Florence would wake in time to eat. But as the sun began to set, he heard footsteps on the stairs, and she appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had changed clothes, wearing a simple gray dress that fit her better than the one she had been wearing, and she had brushed out her hair and pinned it back. The sleep had brought some color back to her cheeks, though she still looked fragile. "I hope I am not intruding," she said. "I smelled food." "Not intruding. I was hoping you would join me." Jack ladled stew into 2 bowls and they sat across from each other at the table. For a few minutes they ate in companionable silence, but Jack found himself wanting to know more about her, wanting to understand what had brought her to his door. "You said you were going to Kansas," he began. "Do you have people there? Someone waiting for you?" Florence shook her head. "No. I just knew there were opportunities there, new towns opening up, people needing seamstresses and cooks. I thought I could find work, make a life." She met his eyes. "I know it sounds foolish. A woman alone, heading west with barely any money and no connections. But staying in Philadelphia meant watching everything my parents built crumble away. The house had too many debts attached to it. My brother and I could not afford to keep it, so we chose to start over." "It is not foolish," Jack said. "It is brave. Terrifying, maybe, but brave. Or desperate." Florence gave him a rueful smile. "There is a fine line between the two, I think." They talked long into the evening, the conversation flowing easily despite them being strangers hours before. Florence told him about Philadelphia, about growing up in a city where the buildings blocked out the sky, about learning to sew from her mother, and to read from her father, who had been a school teacher. Jack shared stories about the ranch, about the year the creek flooded and nearly washed away the barn, about the time he tracked a mountain lion that had been taking his calves and ended up respecting the creature too much to kill it. "What happened to the lion?" Florence asked. "I drove it further into the hills. It never came back." Jack refilled their coffee cups, noting how Florence wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, savoring the heat. "I figured it was just trying to survive, same as me. Seemed wrong to kill it for that." Florence studied him over the rim of her cup. "You are not what I expected when I wrote that note." "What did you expect?" "I do not know. Someone harder, maybe, more rough. This is the frontier, after all, but you are gentle, kind." She looked down, color rising in her cheeks. "I am being too forward. Forgive me." "No," Jack said quickly. "I mean, you are not being too forward. I just do not think of myself that way. Kind." He struggled for words. "Out here you do what needs doing, you help when you can. It is not about being gentle or hard. It is about surviving and helping others survive too." "That is what makes it kind," Florence said softly. That night, Jack lay in his own bed and thought about the woman sleeping in his mother's old room. He thought about her hands, delicate but showing the calluses of work. He thought about her voice, the slight Philadelphia accent that softened her vowels. He thought about how empty the house had felt just yesterday, and how full it seemed now with just one other person in it. This was dangerous territory. He knew that. Florence had her own plans, her own dreams of Kansas and a new life. He was just a way station, a brief stop while she recovered. Getting attached would only lead to pain when she inevitably left. But even knowing that, Jack could not stop the small flame of hope that had kindled in his chest. The next morning, he woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. He dressed quickly and came downstairs to find Florence in the kitchen, moving around with the efficiency of someone who knew her way around a cookstove. She had found his mother's apron hanging on a hook and tied it around her waist. "You should not be cooking," Jack protested. "You are supposed to be resting." "I have rested," Florence said, "and I need to earn my keep. You cannot just feed and shelter me without me contributing something in return." "I do not expect payment, I know, but I expect it of myself." She set a plate in front of him. eggs and bacon and fried potatoes that made his mouth water. "Let me help, Jack, please. I need to feel useful." So they fell into a routine. Florence took over the cooking and the housework, which had been badly neglected during Jack's years alone. She mended his clothes, darned his socks, organized the pantry with an efficiency that amazed him. In return, Jack brought in firewood, carried water, and made sure she had everything she needed. He also began teaching her the basics of ranch work, showing her how to collect eggs from the henhouse without getting pecked, how to slop the pigs, how to tell when a cow was about to calve. Florence proved to be a quick study, asking questions and remembering the answers. She was not afraid of hard work or getting dirty, and Jack found himself looking for excuses to work alongside her, to see her face light up when she mastered a new skill. A week passed, then two. The weather grew colder, and the first real snow of winter began to fall. Jack knew he should bring up the subject of Florence leaving, of making plans for her journey to Kansas. But every time he opened his mouth to do so, the words stuck in his throat. He told himself he was just waiting for the weather to improve, that it would be cruel to send her out into the winter. But the truth was simpler and more selfish. He did not want her to go. Florence seemed content to stay, though Jack sometimes caught her staring out the window toward the west with an expression he could not quite read. Was she thinking about Kansas, about the life she had planned? Or was she, like him, finding it harder to imagine leaving with each passing day? One evening in early December, they sat by the fire after supper, Florence mending one of his shirts while Jack oiled his saddle. The domestic scene felt so natural, so right, that Jack finally found the courage to speak what had been on his mind for days. "Florence," he said, setting aside the saddle. "Can I ask you something?" She looked up from her sewing, firelight playing across her face. "Of course." "Are you happy here?" The question hung in the air between them. Florence set down the shirt, folding it carefully before answering. "Yes," she said simply. "I am. Happier than I have been in a long time." "Then why do you still talk about leaving, about Kansas?" Florence was quiet for a long moment. "Because that was the plan," she said finally. "Because I came west for a purpose, and I do not want to be the kind of person who gives up on her goals at the first obstacle, and because—" She hesitated, then met his eyes. "Because I do not want to presume anything about why you are letting me stay." Jack felt his heart hammering in his chest. "What do you mean? You have been nothing but kind to me, Jack. You saved me when I was desperate, gave me shelter and food, and asked for nothing in return. But I do not know if that is just who you are, or if—" She trailed off, looking away. "I do not want to misunderstand the situation." Jack stood and crossed to where she sat, kneeling down so they were at eye level. "Florence, I need to tell you something. These past few weeks, having you here, they have been the best weeks I have had in years. Maybe ever. I did not realize how lonely I was until you arrived. And I know it is too soon. I know you probably think I am crazy, but I do not want you to go to Kansas. I want you to stay here. With me." Florence's eyes widened, her breath catching. "Jack, I am not asking for anything you are not ready to give," he said quickly. "I know we barely know each other, but I would like the chance to know you better, to see if this thing I am feeling, if you feel it too." He took her hand, so small and warm in his calloused palm. "Do you?" "Yes," Florence whispered. "I do. I have been trying not to, telling myself I could not afford to get attached, that I had to stick to my plan. But every day I find another reason to stay. Every time I look at you, every time we talk, I think about how this feels like home in a way Philadelphia never did." Jack felt something break open inside him, some wall he had built around his heart crumbling away. "Then stay. Please, stay and let us see where this goes." Florence cupped his face in her hands, her touch gentle. "I am scared," she admitted. I am scared of needing someone again, of being hurt, but I am more scared of walking away and spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been." Jack leaned forward and kissed her, soft and careful, giving her every chance to pull away. But she did not. She kissed him back, her fingers threading through his hair, and it was like coming home after a long journey. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jack rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he said again, the word a prayer and a promise. "I will stay," Florence answered. The winter passed in a blur of quiet joy. Jack had never been happier, waking each morning to find Florence already up and making breakfast, spending his days working the ranch with her help, his evenings talking by the fire or reading aloud from the books his mother had loved. They learned each other's rhythms and habits, the way couples do when building a life together. Jack learned that Florence hummed while she cooked, old hymns and folk songs from her childhood. He learned that she was afraid of thunder, but would never admit it, instead sitting very still during storms with her hands clasped tight in her lap, until he moved closer and held her. He learned that she had a wicked sense of humor that came out when she felt safe, making him laugh harder than he had in years. Florence learned that Jack was a morning person, up before dawn no matter the weather, and that he preferred to work through problems in silence before talking about them. She learned that he had nightmares sometimes, waking in the dark gasping for air, though he never told her what he dreamed about. She learned that, despite his quiet demeanor, he felt things deeply, and once he loved someone, that love ran bone deep and unshakable. By the time spring arrived, painting the prairie with wildflowers and turning the creek high with snowmelt, they had become essential to each other in ways neither could quite articulate. Jack could not imagine his morning coffee without Florence sitting across from him, discussing their plans for the day. Florence could not imagine sleeping anywhere but in the ranch house, knowing Jack was just down the hall if she needed him. One warm evening in April, as they walked along the creek watching the sunset, Jack stopped and turned to face Florence. He had been planning this moment for weeks, carrying his grandmother's ring in his pocket and waiting for the right time. "Florence Lancaster," he said, taking both her hands in his. "I know we have not known each other long by traditional standards, just 5 months, but I know my own heart and I know yours. I see the way you look at me, the way you smile when I come in from the fields. I feel how you fit into my life like you were always meant to be there." Florence's eyes were already shining with tears. "Jack, let me finish," he said gently. "I am not a rich man. This ranch is all I have to offer, but it is yours if you want it. I am yours if you want me. Will you marry me, Florence? Will you stay here, not as a guest or even as a partner, but as my wife?" Florence was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face as she nodded. "Yes," she said. "Yes, of course I will marry you. I love you, Jack O'Brien. I think I started loving you the moment you came looking for me instead of ignoring that note." Jack slipped the ring onto her finger, a simple gold band with a small garnet that had belonged to his grandmother. It fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her. He kissed her then, properly, without the restraint they had been maintaining over the winter. Florence kissed him back with equal fervor, and when they finally pulled apart, both were breathless and grinning like fools. They were married 3 weeks later in Independence, at the small church on Main Street. Florence wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric Jack had bought her as a surprise, pale blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes. Jack wore his only suit, brushed clean and pressed with Florence's help. The ceremony was small, attended by a handful of Jack's neighbors and Florence's brother David, who had ridden out from town with his new wife Martha. David had been nervous about seeing Florence, worried she would be angry that he had let her continue on alone. But when Florence threw her arms around him and told him how happy she was, how everything had worked out exactly as it was meant to, the tension melted away. "You found a good man," David whispered to his sister as they waited for the ceremony to begin. "Better than I could have hoped for." "I did," Florence agreed, watching Jack talk with the minister. "I really did." The ceremony itself was simple but heartfelt. When the minister asked if they had vows they wanted to share, Jack spoke first, his voice rough with emotion. "Florence, I vow to work hard to give you the life you deserve. I vow to listen when you speak and to value your thoughts and dreams as much as my own. I vow to stand beside you in good times and bad, and to love you until my last breath. You saved me from loneliness. You gave me hope again. I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of that gift." Florence was crying again, but she smiled through her tears as she spoke her own vows. "Jack, I vow to be your partner in all things, to work beside you and support you and build this life with you. I vow to trust you with my fears and my joys. I vow to love you not just today, but every day forward with everything I have. You gave me a home when I had none, and a future when I could not see past the next day. You are the answer to prayers I did not know how to pray." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Jack kissed Florence to the applause and cheers of their small gathering. It felt like the beginning of everything. They held a simple reception at the ranch, with food prepared by Martha and some of the neighbor women who had taken Florence under their wing. There was music and dancing, and Jack, who had always claimed he could not dance, waltzed Florence around the front yard while the stars came out overhead. "Happy," he murmured into her ear. "Happier than I knew I could be," Florence replied, resting her head against his shoulder. That night, they came together as husband and wife in Jack's bedroom, which was now their bedroom. It was tender and a little awkward, as first times often are, but it was also full of love and patience and the deep trust they had built over the past months. Afterward, lying tangled together in the sheets, Florence traced patterns on Jack's chest. "I was so lost when I wrote that note," she said softly. "I did not really expect anyone to find it, or if they did, to care. I thought I would probably die out there by the creek, that all my dreams would end in that cold little shelter I built." Jack tightened his arms around her. "I am so glad I found it, so glad I found you." "Do you believe in fate?" Florence asked. "In things being meant to be?" "I never used to," Jack admitted. "But now, yes. I think you were meant to find my ranch. I think I was meant to find that note. Everything that happened, all the hardships that brought you here, they led us to each other." "Then I am grateful for every hard mile," Florence whispered. "Because they brought me home." The years that followed were full and rich. Florence threw herself into ranch life with enthusiasm, learning everything Jack could teach her about cattle and horses and the rhythms of the land. She proved to have a natural talent for managing money, and under her guidance, the ranch began to prosper in ways it never had when Jack worked alone. They expanded the herd, built a new barn, added rooms to the house. Florence started a large vegetable garden that kept them supplied with fresh food through the summer and canned goods through the winter. She also began taking and sewing work from women in Independence, her skill with a needle becoming well known in the area. Jack, for his part, became known as one of the most reliable ranchers in the region, a man whose word was his bond and whose cattle were always healthy and well cared for. He hired a few permanent hands as the operation grew, young men who looked up to him and appreciated the fair way he treated them. But the greatest joy came 2 years after their marriage, when Florence discovered she was expecting their first child. Jack was working in the barn when she came running out to tell him, her face glowing with excitement. Jack, I need to tell you something." He dropped the bale of hay he was carrying and rushed to her. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I am more than all right." Florence grabbed his hands, placing them on her still, flat belly. "I am pregnant. We are going to have a baby." Jack stared at her in wonder, then let out a whoop of joy that startled the horses in their stalls. He picked Florence up and spun her around, both of them laughing like children. "A baby," he kept repeating. "We are going to have a baby." The pregnancy was not easy. Florence suffered terrible morning sickness for the first few months, and as she grew larger, the summer heat became oppressive. But she never complained, and Jack did everything he could to make her comfortable. He brought her cool drinks from the spring, rubbed her aching back, read to her in the evenings when she was too tired to do anything but rest. On a cold January morning in 1879, Florence went into labor. Jack rode hard to fetch the doctor from Independence and stayed by her side through the long, difficult hours that followed. When their son was finally born, screaming and red-faced and perfect, Jack wept openly. They named him Thomas David, after both their fathers. He had Jack's dark hair and Florence's brown eyes, and from the beginning, he was a happy, curious baby who slept well and smiled often. Jack had never known he could love anyone as much as he loved Florence, but Thomas expanded his heart in ways he had not thought possible. "Look at him," Florence would say, watching Jack hold their son with such tenderness. "Look at how gentle you are with him." "He is so small," Jack would reply, marveling at the tiny hands that gripped his finger. "So perfect. How did we make something so perfect?" Life settled into a new rhythm, shaped around Thomas and the ranch and each other. 2 years later, Florence gave birth to their daughter, Sarah Louise, who had her mother's spirit and her father's determination. She was a handful from the start, always climbing things she should not climb, always asking questions, always moving. Then came another son, William James, who was quiet and thoughtful, preferring books to ranch work, but earning his father's respect through his intelligence and kind heart. And finally, when Florence thought they were done having children, twin girls arrived, Emma and Grace, identical in looks but opposite in temperament. The ranch house that had once echoed with silence now rang with children's laughter, with arguments and play and the constant noise of a large family. Jack sometimes stood on the porch at sunset, watching his children play in the yard while Florence prepared supper, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude for how his life had turned out. "What are you thinking?" Florence asked one evening, coming out to stand beside him, wiping her hands on her apron. "I am thinking about that note," Jack said. "The one you pinned to my door. How different everything would be if I had not found it." Florence leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her waist. They had both put on weight over the years, comfortable weight that came from good food and happiness. Florence's hair had threads of gray now, and Jack's face was lined from years in the sun. But when he looked at her, he still saw the desperate, brave woman he had found by Willow Creek, and his heart still skipped a beat. "I think about it too," Florence said. "I think about how scared I was, how certain I was that I would die alone out there. And then you came, like an answer to a prayer I had not even finished praying." "I was so lonely before you," Jack admitted. "I did not even realize how lonely until you were here and the silence was filled. You saved me too, you know." Florence turned to kiss him, soft and sweet despite the children who might see and giggle. "We saved each other. That is what love does." The years continued to pass. Thomas grew tall and strong, taking over more and more of the ranch work as Jack's back began to ache from decades of hard labor. Sarah married a banker from Kansas City and moved away, though she visited often with her own children. William became a teacher in Independence, following in his grandfather's footsteps. Emma and Grace, inseparable as always, opened a dress shop in town that became quite successful. Jack and Florence grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. They never tired of each other's company, still sitting by the fire in the evenings like they had when they were first getting to know each other. Their hands were more wrinkled now, their movements slower, but the love in their eyes never dimmed. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party at the ranch. All 5 children were there, along with their spouses and the growing number of grandchildren. The house was full to bursting, exactly how Florence had always wanted it. As the sun set and the party wound down, Jack found Florence standing by the creek, looking out over the water that flowed steady and clear. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. 30 years, he said. Can you believe it? Some days it feels like 30 years, Florence replied with a smile. All the work we have done, the children we have raised, the life we have built. But other days, it feels like yesterday that you came riding up to my shelter at Willow Creek. I fell in love with you that day, Jack confessed. I tried to tell myself I was just helping someone in need, but I looked at you and something in me recognized something in you. Like we were always supposed to find each other. Florence turned in his arms to face him. I fell in love with you too. When you offered me food, when you brought me to your home and gave me safety, I knew I had found someone special, someone worth staying for. Do you ever regret it? Jack asked. Giving up Kansas, giving up the life you planned. Never, Florence said firmly. Not for one single day. This life, this ranch, you and our children, this is better than anything I could have planned. This is everything I did not know I needed. They kissed then, long and slow, while the creek burbled beside them and their family laughed in the house behind them. It was a perfect moment, the kind that makes a whole life worthwhile. Jack lived to be 82 years old, Florence to 80. They died within 6 months of each other, Jack first in his sleep on a warm summer night, Florence following as the leaves began to turn that fall. Their children buried them in the family plot on the ranch, under an oak tree they had planted together in their first year of marriage. Thomas took over the ranch after they were gone, running it with the same care and dedication his father had shown. He kept his mother's garden going, kept the house maintained exactly as his parents had left it. Sometimes, when he was working in the fields or sitting on the porch at sunset, he swore he could feel them there, his father's steady presence and his mother's warm love surrounding him like an embrace. In the years after their deaths, the story of Jack and Florence became something of a legend in Independence. People talked about the lonely rancher who found a note pinned to his door, who went searching for a desperate woman and ended up finding the love of his life. They talked about the woman who traveled alone from Philadelphia with nothing but hope and determination, who wrote a plea for help and received more than she could have dreamed. The note itself, carefully preserved in a frame, hung in the ranch house for generations. Florence's delicate handwriting had faded some, but the words were still legible. To whoever lives here, I need help. I have been traveling for 3 weeks from Pennsylvania. My wagon broke down 2 miles east near Willow Creek. I have little food left and winter is coming. If you have any kindness in your heart, please find me. I will repay you however I can. Florence Lancaster. Those words, written in desperation by a woman at the end of her rope, had changed 2 lives completely. They had brought together 2 lonely souls and created a family, a legacy, a love story that would be remembered long after the ink had faded away. Jack's grandson, another Jack O'Brien, would sometimes read the note to his own children, telling them the story of their great-grandparents. Your great-grandmother was the bravest woman I never met, he would say. And your great-grandfather was the kindest man I knew. Together, they built something beautiful out of hardship and hope. That is what love does. It takes two people who are lost and makes them found. The ranch itself continued to thrive, passed down through the generations, always keeping the name O'Brien. The house was renovated and expanded over the years, but the core remained the same. The room where Florence had first slept was preserved as it had been, a shrine to the beginning of it all. And on quiet nights, when the wind blew across the prairie and the stars shone bright overhead, the current inhabitants of the ranch would sometimes swear they could hear two voices, laughing and talking by the creek, as timeless and eternal as the land itself. The story of Jack and Florence became more than just a family tale. It became a reminder that sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead to the best ones. That sometimes getting lost is the only way to find where we truly belong. That sometimes a simple act of kindness can change everything. Thomas, in his later years, wrote down everything he could remember about his parents, wanting future generations to know their story in full. He described his father's quiet strength, his mother's fierce determination. He wrote about the love he had witnessed between them, the way they looked at each other even after decades of marriage, the way they moved together like dancers who had practiced the same steps for so long they did not need to think about it. My father once told me, Thomas wrote, that finding my mother was like finding a piece of himself he did not know was missing. And my mother said that my father gave her not just a home, but a place to belong. They were two halves of the same whole, and watching them love each other taught me what marriage should be. Not perfect, not without struggles, but always choosing each other, always coming back together no matter what life threw at them. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren who read Thomas's words understood that they came from something special, that their existence was the result of a love story that had beaten the odds. They took pride in their heritage, in the ranch that represented so much more than land and cattle. On the 100th anniversary of Jack and Florence's meeting, the family held a reunion at the ranch. Dozens of descendants gathered, many meeting for the first time, all connected by the thread of one desperate note and one kind heart. They stood together at the creek where Jack had found Florence all those years ago, and someone read the note aloud, Florence's words echoing across the water. To whoever lives here, I need help. And someone had come. Someone had cared. Someone had looked at a stranger's plea and decided to act. That decision had rippled out across time, creating this family, these lives, this legacy. It was a testament to the power of compassion, the importance of seeing and responding to others' needs. It was proof that love could bloom in the most unexpected places, between the most unlikely people. The ranch still stands today, a working operation and a historical landmark. The note is kept in a climate-controlled case now, protected from further deterioration. Tourists sometimes visit, wanting to see where the famous love story began, wanting to stand where Jack and Florence stood and imagine what it must have been like. But for the O'Brien family, it was never about fame or legend. It was about remembering where they came from, honoring the courage and kindness that had started it all. It was about carrying forward the values Jack and Florence had embodied: hard work, compassion, dedication to family, and above all, love. The last thing Thomas wrote in his memoir about his parents was this: "Some people live their whole lives and never find what my parents had. They were lucky, yes, but they also chose each other every single day. They chose love over loneliness, hope over despair, together over alone." If there is anything I want my children and grandchildren to take from their story, it is this: be brave enough to ask for help when you need it, and be kind enough to give it when you can. You never know when a simple act of compassion will change your life, or someone else's, forever. And so the story ends, not with sadness but with joy. Not with an ending but with a continuation, as love stories do. Jack and Florence may be gone, but their love remains, woven into the fabric of the land they worked, the house they built, the family they raised. It lives on in every act of kindness their descendants perform, in every time someone chooses compassion over indifference. The note that started it all remains the same, yellowed and faded but still legible, still powerful. To whoever lives here, I need help. And help came, in the form of a lonely rancher who did not know he was searching for exactly what he found. In finding Florence, Jack found himself. In being found, Florence found her home. It was a story as old as time and as unique as a fingerprint. It was the story of two people who should never have met, who had every reason not to work, who defied the odds and built something beautiful. It was proof that sometimes the best things in life come from the worst moments, that rock bottom can be the foundation for something incredible. The land around Independence, Missouri, has changed much since 1876. Where there were once wide open spaces, there are now roads and buildings. Where there were once trails, there are now highways. But the O'Brien Ranch remains, an island of history in a sea of progress, a reminder of a time when life was harder but perhaps in some ways simpler. And if you stand very still on that land, especially near the creek where it all began, you might feel something. Not a ghost exactly, but an echo. The echo of a love that was strong enough to transcend time, of a moment when one person's desperation met another person's kindness and created something eternal. That is what Jack and Florence left behind. Not just descendants or property or a story, but a legacy of love. The kind of love that makes the world a little bit better, a little bit kinder, a little bit more hopeful. The kind of love that proves, beyond any doubt, that sometimes the right person finds us exactly when we need them most. And sometimes, all it takes is a note pinned to a door, and someone kind enough to come looking,